This is the fiscal year 2026-27 Meet and Confer for the Quadrennial Total Compensation Survey process. My name is Annabelle Asp, and I'm the statewide communications manager for the state's Division of Human Resources. I would like to just go over a few things to keep in mind throughout our presentation today. We have disabled the chat function, so if you have questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will be addressing questions at the end of today's presentation, so just know that and hang tight. Also, we are recording the presentation section of today's webinar, and we will ensure that we will have closed captioning for the posted version, which will be available, excuse me, on our Division of Human Resources website. With that, I will now turn it over to Scott Ciclari, who is the compensation manager for the state of Colorado within the Division of Human Resources. Thanks again, everybody. And Scott, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Annabelle. Quick apology in advance, still getting over a bit of a cold, so I have to take a few pauses to cough. Please forgive me. First, just a quick look at the agenda today. I'll remind everybody we're just focusing on the process and methodology. Today, we're not going to talk about results. Those won't be available until October 1st when the report is published. So on that note, we'll be looking at the state's total compensation model and the survey process that we use to assess the total compensation model. We'll look at our labor market. We'll talk a little bit about the method that we use to select our benchmark jobs. Now, those are the jobs that we actually compare to the market when we're looking at our base salaries and pay ranges. We'll talk about the survey data that we use to compare our compensation packages to the market. We'll have a special section regarding state patrol troopers because they have a specific clause within statute that defines a slightly different methodology to determine their base salaries and pay ranges. And then this year, because it's a quadrennial year, we'll also talk about our benefits and retirement programs that were assessed in addition to base salaries. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. And then finally, on the last slide, we'll do a very high-level summary of how the process works. Okay, so quick overview. Every year, DPA analyzes survey data to measure and compare our compensation packages that are offered to classified employees. Now, the purpose is to determine whether our class structure is current, accurate, and whether pay grades and the relationships between those pay grades are appropriate. Then we will take a look at whether there are any specific classes that we need to revise, abolish, new ones that we need to create, or otherwise make any revisions. So as I mentioned, this year is what we call the quadrennial analysis. So it's required that we do it every 4 years. And in addition to compensation, we review benefits and retirement packages. And all of those things together are what we call total compensation. And to do this, we have a third-party independent consultant. This year, we selected Mercer, who we've also used the past several years to complete our analysis. And they're a globally recognized firm, considered experts in these types of analyses. And that's who we use to do our actual market analysis. Now, we invite all employees to the meet and confer so we can discuss the process. And this way, what we're hoping to do is encourage a better understanding of the process for everybody. And then, like Annabelle said, keep in mind that all of these slides, they'll be published on the DHR website, and we'll have the URL for that website on the final slide of the presentation today. So what is total compensation? So first, I want to mention the statute that actually defines our compensation philosophy. And I'll quote it here because I think it's important to understand. It is the policy of the state to provide innovative total compensation that meets or exceeds total compensation provided by public or private sector employers, or a combination of both, to employees in the state personnel system to ensure the recruitment, motivation, and retention of a qualified and competent workforce. So a bit of a mouthful there, but I think it's important to kind of understand what we're looking at. So in this year, quadrennial year, we reviewed a combination of our base salaries as well as all employee benefits. And when we talk about that, we are referring to both direct and indirect compensation. And in general, I think it's good to keep in mind that as a state, we have more control over things like benefits than we do over salaries. And our job within DHR is to make sure that we're doing everything we can to help your agencies implement best practices in those areas. Right. So this slide illustrates the steps that we take. Very high level steps. There's lots of steps within these steps. Uh, and also keeping in mind that many of these overlap. So it's not exactly like a simple, step one, step two, step three type of a process. And we'll talk about each of these more in detail on the following slides. But on a high level, we first identify our labor market, which is the geographic region in which the state competes for talent. Then we identify what we call our benchmark jobs, and those are the jobs that we actually use to compare, to go out and compare our structure against the labor market. Then we identify the best available sources of market data so we can select the ones that are most relevant to our labor market. And then finally, we take that external market data and we compare it to the state's current pay practices. And that includes both pay ranges and the actual salaries paid to employees. Quick look at the timeline here. We put together a report and then we publish it and we send it to the legislature for budget consideration. So everything in the report, any recommendations that we make, are all subject to the legislative process. On November 1st is when the governor submits that proposal. And then in May, after that legislative process has completed, the state personnel director announces the final compensation plan for the upcoming fiscal year. And then it's all implemented on July 1st, which is the first day of the fiscal year. Now, statute defines what our labor market is. So we have a little bit more detail here. And basically, the statute says that our labor market includes all regions within Colorado, as well as regions outside of Colorado. So when we can, we gather data as specific to the state as possible. That's not always available. With some jobs where there is a lot of data, we're usually able to find data specific to Colorado. For others jobs, there's less data, and sometimes we have to widen our scope to make sure that we get enough data to make sure that what we're looking at is accurate. And then again, we look at both private and public sector data because, of course, we compete not just with the public sector, we also compete with the private sector for talent. So now we'll talk a little bit more about our benchmark jobs. When we're benchmarking our jobs, we make sure that we're comparing our jobs with similar jobs in the labor market. Makes sense. We take our official class descriptions and then we compare those to job descriptions in the market surveys. And that way we're making sure that we're only looking at relevant data when we're comparing our base salaries and pay ranges to the market. So this year we had a total of 270 jobs. It's about 36% of our total number of classifications. And of those, about half we consider core jobs. So the core jobs we review every year so that we can get a good sense of trends in the market. And uh, some of those jobs we think are important for a variety of reasons. One, we make sure that we're getting a good representation across all of our different occupational groups. We're making sure that we get a good representation of all of our levels. We're not just comparing our managers, we're not just comparing our entry level jobs. We're looking at all of our different levels across the state. We'll make sure that some jobs that often have recruitment or retention issues are included in that core group. And then there are certain critical staffing roles that are identified in the partnership agreement. We make sure that we include in our core group and review every year. Now, the remaining half of our benchmark jobs are rotated on an annual basis, and we do that so that we can make sure that we're looking at all of our job classifications regularly. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that this is always a moving target. We are doing our best to maintain the pay structure, but the labor market is always changing. And for that reason, it's just important to keep in mind that it never stops. We're always going to be chasing that competitive package because the labor market continues to move. So we'll talk a little bit about the surveys that we use. We use a pretty robust selection, and that way we're making sure that we get as much and as high quality data as we possibly can. So for any survey that's included in our analysis, we make sure that it is conducted by a well-known, reputable firm. We make sure that it's a survey that's conducted on a continual basis, usually annually, as opposed to a one-time event. And that way we make sure that we're able to look at trends, that the data can be consistent year over year. And then we also make sure that the survey reports its data sources as well as the effective date of the data so that we can make sure that it's relevant to us. This is just a small sample list of some of the different surveys that we use. We don't use every single source every single year, and some of the sources we rely upon a bit more heavily than others. But all of these sources are from reputable organizations, and they all have reliable, consistent, high quality compensation surveys. And we'll have a full list of the survey sources that were used this year when we publish the report. So when we actually collect our data after we've got our sources, the most important step is that we're matching our jobs to an appropriate job within the surveys. So that job needs to be as similar as possible so that we can make sure it's relevant. To make sure that we're doing that, we take our class descriptions that again they're available on the DHR website, and we compare them to job descriptions within the surveys. And in general, we try to make sure that the duties of both the state job and the survey job are at least an 80% match whenever we can. We'll also adjust the data in the survey. We also adjust the survey data to make sure that we're aging it to the same effective date as that of the following fiscal year's pay plan. So what we're doing is we're measuring where our pay is today, and we're comparing it to where the market will be, where it's projected to be on July 1st, 2026, so that we can make recommendations that will then bring us up to where we need to be competitive on July 1st, 2026, because that's what we're talking about with the report, the pay plan that we'll implement next year. And we also look at other factors that are important to maintaining the structure. We don't just want to look at the types of duties that are for any given job. We also want to make sure we're matching the right level. So we want to match our entry jobs to entry jobs, our intermediate jobs to intermediate jobs, manager jobs to manager jobs, etc. We'll want to make sure also that we're looking at the right market. So, like I've mentioned a couple of times, we use a mix of both public and private sector. We also include nonprofit employers in our analysis. And whenever possible, we use the state of Colorado. Sometimes we have to expand that scope if there's not enough data available within the state of Colorado, but generally speaking, we do our best to look at Colorado's labor market. So just as a quick example, this is a actual description from one of the surveys that we use. The description has two components. One, we have the job family, or what we would typically refer to at the state as a series. And in this case, that's human resources. And then the description also describes a level. That's the other component. And in this case, that's the intermediate level. So what we do is we take both of these components, we go to our class descriptions, and for this example, what we would typically compare it to is the Human Resources Specialist 2 classification because it has a good series match. Our series description matches well with the job family description, and our level, intermediate, matches well with the survey's level description. So just an example of pretty simple example of how we, what we might be comparing our classifications to when we look at our surveys. So when we're looking at the data, we calculate some statistics so we have a good summary. We'll typically look at the mean, we'll look at the median, the 25th to 75th percentiles, and we'll look at some other metrics as well. But overall, when we're looking at our pay ranges, we usually give a little bit more weight to the average. And then for our salaries, we usually give more weight to the median. Now, the reason for that is within pay ranges, there are less outliers. And then within salaries, there are more outliers. So the median is usually a data point that will smooth out some of those outliers, whereas an average doesn't always do that. So that's why we look at the average for pay ranges and the median for our salaries. Now, just a couple quick comments about state troopers. Pardon. They have a specific clause within CRS 2450104 that defines what their labor market is, and it says that their salaries must be at least 99% of the average actual salaries provided to the top 3 law enforcement agencies in Colorado that have at least 100 commissioned officers and the highest average salary. So just like our other classified jobs, we'll take our classifications duties within the state trooper series, and we match those duties to classifications within other law enforcement agencies throughout Colorado, and then we find the average salary at each of the top 3 uh, for each of those agencies, and then we set our pay range minimums according to that to the results of that analysis. Now, that's most of our comments regarding compensation, so base salaries and pay ranges. But as I mentioned, in a quadrennial year, Mercer also reviews our practices regarding other types of compensation, like premium pay, and it also reviews our benefits and retirement packages. So the next slides will describe the methodology around those. For premium pay, what that means is we're talking about on-call pay, callback pay, shift differentials, those types of things. And Mercer has a national survey, their pay policies and practices survey, that they use to compare our practices to both the amount and the prevalence of different types of premium pay. So they look at how many employers offer call pay, what is the dollar amount that employers offer for call pay, and then they report that back to us. Now, for benefits and retirement, there is also a separate methodology that they use to assess our programs. Rather than looking at big, broad surveys for benefits and retirement, we actually have a defined peer group. So our peer group that we work with Mercer to determine, similar employers that we compete with for talent, it includes 50 organizations coming from both the public and the private sector. So we assessed our programs from both a qualitative and quantitative perspective. So again, we measured those programs against both the design and the prevalence of benefits in our peer group. And we also calculated the overall analyzed value of our benefits packages and compared those to the value of benefits packages offered in the peer group. And Mercer has a benefits benchmarking database that they use to gather data from our peer group. For our health insurance, dental, vision, and life, Mercer compares our packages across all coverage tiers and all plan types. And then more specifically, they look at a few key plan provisions, uh, including cost share, deductibles, limits or out-of-pocket maximums, co-insurance, and then they use those to calculate the overall value of our benefits packages. For retirement, Mercer used actual employee demographic data and made certain assumptions, standard assumptions for salary growth, cost of living adjustments, and investment returns to both calculate and then compare the value of our retirement packages to those of the peer group. Now, the state employees are provided with retirement benefits through Colorado PARA, and we don't participate in Social Security. But some of the employers within the peer group do participate in Social Security. So when we're doing our comparison, we do include the benefits and costs of Social Security so that we get an actual accurate idea of how the overall value of our retirement packages compare with the retirement packages of the peer group. Now for disability, Mercer used a more qualitative measurement of the state's offerings for both short and long-term benefits. They looked at the prevalence of the types of benefits offered at the employers in our peer group. They looked at the length of coverage, and they looked at the amount of salary that's paid out. So whether you're paid 60% of your salary, 100% of your salary, um, that's what we mean by amount of salary. And then also keeping in mind that they also included the value of short and long-term benefits that are offered through PARA's defined benefit plan, which I believe is for employees with greater than 5 years of tenure. They're also offered additional disability benefits through PARA's programs. And then the last slide before we get to our summary, um, leave and other benefits like, wellness programs, they're not easily quantifiable in terms of an actual dollar value. So while they weren't included in the overall value calculation of our benefits, Mercer did do a qualitative assessment of these as well. And that way we'll have, at least some idea of, how we're doing compared to other employers in the market in terms of our, sick leave, holidays, total days off. And then also, what employers in our peer group offer those wellness programs, which offer parking benefits, which ones offer childcare, that kind of thing. So we covered a lot. And just to kind of give a high level look at what we're doing when we're doing our quadrennial look at total compensation, we take our total compensation as a full package, including both cash and non-cash benefits. So that's base salary, premium pay, health coverage, leave, disability, retirement, all of that, all of those components that make up total compensation. We then add them all together and we compare them to the labor market. And what it does is it gives us an understanding of how we compare to the market. And that is ultimately what guides our recommendations that, again, are subject to the legislative process. They guide our recommendations so that we can help our structures, our base salaries, our class descriptions, and our benefits be as competitive with the market as we can. So that concludes our prepared remarks, and we'll start addressing questions to see if you have come through. Again, a reminder, we're not discussing the results of the analysis today since the final report has not yet been published. And then also, if you have specific questions about your own pay or the step pay program or your individual your step placement, your best first resource will be your human resources team. So with that, I will pop open the Q&A section here.